Okay guys, welcome to episode 13. Here's our last video of introduction, and it's going to be a recap and a summation of all that we've talked about so far, laying a very broad stroke in an overview, a 30,000 foot view of the Gospel of Mark. Just going to conclude it here to tie it all together, and then we're going to get right into the meat and potatoes, the thick of it. So I appreciate you hanging in there with me, and this is going to get awesome, I tell you. So let's put it all together. Let's get into what Mark is really all about. So we've walked through the entire gospel with a bird's eye view and talked about major themes in the gospel. Okay, trying to frame it back in its original context, socio-cultural and historical context, try to understand it as the original audience would have. And I know a lot of people are trying to do that as well, but we're trying to do this without importing later ideas into it and having those ideas blur our understanding of what was actually being accomplished. That's a very difficult task to do, and I'm by no means saying I've got it figured out, but I'm just trying to get us another step closer. So it's worth stepping back and naming major threads that run through everything. So these ideas are not coming from later Christian theology, not to say that there's no merit there, but we're just trying to get into what is the emerging directly from within the narrative of Scripture, the drama and the saga of Scripture, rooted in the Jewish world that Mark was writing into and within. Okay, so major theme number one, the exile of Israel is not over. However, the coming of Christ signals that restoration is coming and God is going to do what he's promised. So from the very first verse, Mark frames his story against the backdrop of Isaiah's promise of a new Exodus, working off of what Moses already promised in Leviticus, Genesis, and Deuteronomy, okay? Israel's deepest hope wasn't just political freedom from Rome, it was the return of God himself, Yahweh himself, to his people, redeeming his people, healing the land, the gathering of all of the dispersed of Israel, and everything that the prophets had promised, which the nations are on the horizon. Every major movement in Mark's gospel is silhouetted against that backdrop and that horizon, okay? Number two is that the present evil age is a cosmic battlefield, okay? Mark's world is not a neutral stage in which human events unfold. It's actually contested territory where cosmic evil, what Paul says, the powers and principalities, the ruler of this world, the powers of the air, they've been permitted by God to operate, but their time is running out and they know it. And it was officially sealed at the resurrection of the Messiah. Okay? The exorcisms, the passion predictions of suffering and taking up his cross, the apocalyptic discourse about these eschatological things and the remnant and all these awesome things, that all reflects this very conviction that God's reign is going to break in, and its imminent arrival means both liberation for the oppressed and cosmic mortal combat against the powers that oppress the people of God and the righteous and the marginalized and the oppressed. Okay? We have another one that holiness moves offensively in this age to come, this messianic age. So in the book of Leviticus, holiness was somewhat defensive, okay? It was something like the whole idea of the Levitical cult was not to substitute me for this animal because God doesn't want to spend time with me or he hates me unless I kill something to make his wrath go away. That's not what is in play at all. Rather, the sanctuary was God's dwelling space, and God is holy. And the ways that men and humans and people in a society operates that are finite, that are corruptible and susceptible to mortality, which means we age, we decay, we bleed, we get hurt, things happen, we get diseased, we have blood emissions, seminal emissions, we have all these things. This contaminates sacred space, and it just can't be when there's a holy God. So the blood that has life in it, okay, functions as a decontamination, which it decontaminates the space so that God can dwell. It's a completely different idea in a category. And then we also have the Passover Lamb of Redemption. So without getting too much into the weeds there, all of this is to maintain and protect sacred space, which is defensive by implication. In Mark, the messianic eschatological agent, when God's reign finally breaks in, it's going to drive away all of that stuff, and none of that stuff is going to be really relevant anymore. And so holiness of the holiness of Christ operates offensively, okay? It moves outward aggressively and overcomes impurity rather than retreating from it. So every healing, cleansing, and every dead person raised is an eschatological or end-time focused apocalyptic sign, is evidence that when God's kingdom finally arrives, it does not avoid the broken and defiled, but it transforms them and restores them to full covenant participation as image bearers of God. Okay? Super cool concept. Now, another one is that Jesus argues within Judaism, within the Torah debates, not against them. Okay? So the conflicts with Pharisees, scribes, and temple authorities are not Christianity versus Judaism or law versus grace. These are super later ideas that distort the text by a mile. So it's a prophetic voice, really, coming against institutional power. Okay? And this is why the suppression of prophets has been so pointed through Israel's history. So when you look at the persecution of the prophets, it's always because they would have claims against or oracles from God against, of judgment against or admonition against the established leaders, whether they're corrupt kings or corrupt priests. It's no different here. Okay, same idea, the same trajectory, the same tradition. A debate that Israel's own prophets obviously have been having for centuries. So Jesus appeals consistently to the covenantal priorities and the heart of the Torah, which comprise of justice, mercy, and fidelity, faithfulness, against interpretive traditions that maybe had calcified around boundary maintenance and institutional self-preservation. So that's what's happening here, and they don't like him for this. There's more to that, but we'll get into that as we get into the granular of the actual text itself. Now, the Messiah actually accomplishes redemption and is vindicated by first giving his life as a ransom. So Mark's most theologically striking contribution is that the deliverer doesn't arrive as a conquering king, which is not it's not a monolithic idea in the Second Temple period. Not all of the Jews expected a Davidic king to come now. Some did, and he will actually come like that. That's still going to happen, but it's not just Rome. It's much more grand and much more cosmic than that. The decisive victory of Israel's God through his suffering, rejected servant is death that precedes vindication and glory. Okay, so death and suffering precede vindication and glory. That is the pattern that we are called to participate in as would-be followers of the Messiah. And this is the covenant story of Israel in history. Okay? Hope that makes sense. The pattern has deep roots in the Psalms, the Maccabean tradition, the servant songs with the prophets, especially Isaiah. This wasn't invented by the early church. Mark is drawing on threads already woven into Israel's scriptures and pressing them into their conclusion. Okay? Apocalyptically. The Son of Man framework. Again, suffering before glory. So Daniel's vision of the Son of Man receiving the kingdom after the beastly empires are defeated gives Mark the theological wording, the grammar, the construct for holding together what kind of seems contradictory in intention. How can the Messianic king, how can he suffer and die? But Daniel's own vision shows that the faithful suffering under the beastly empires ruled by the powers of this world before they receive the kingdom. This is what Daniel's chronology demonstrates. And Jesus walks that path as Israel's agent, Israel's representative through the crushing and on the other side. So he's crushed and then he's vindicated by God for being righteous. Okay? Discipleship, following the master, following the Messiah in Mark's gospel, but in general, but especially in Mark's gospel, is never presented as a private, spiritual, individualistic journey. However, it is a public allegiance to the God of Israel and his incoming kingdom in a world that allegiance to the God of Israel as the coming king who's going to overthrow all of the kings of the earth, especially and including Caesar, which he'd put you on the cross too. It would cost you everything. But remember, suffering precedes vindication. vindication. After vindication comes glory, just like the Messiah. He's calling us to embrace that path. So we would submit ourselves to this torture and barbarous opposition and oppression because we believe the oracles of God are true. He's going to do what he's promised. Okay? And what's coming later is infinitely, significantly, substantially much greater than what we experience today in this present evil age, where death, corruption, oppression, decay is a reality for us all. So the cross was Rome's obvious instrument of political terror, and taking it up was not a metaphor. It did not mean, embracing hardship and adversity now, and, not, being humble and letting somebody, have their way over me. That's not what it's about at all. Mark's discipleship material is written for people who understand that following Jesus can get you killed, and calls them to do it anyways because the end is worth it. All right? And so the last thing is that the nations were always part of the vision. They were always part from really the beginning, but especially Genesis 12 with the calling of Abram. It's not separated. So Jesus' encounters with those of the nations, the Gentiles, through Mark's gospel aren't detours from Israel's story. They are foretastes of what Israel's prophets have always said would happen when God's kingdom came. The nations will be streaming up to Israel's God in the coming kingdom within the orbit of the covenant, experiencing his mercy and his power and his righteousness and his instructions and his kingship. And so the restoration of Israel was never meant to be the end of the story. It was always meant to be the catalyst and the vehicle to bring redemption and blessing to all of the nations. And so all of the nations would once again be loyal to the God of Israel. That is the story, guys. That's Israel's calling in a nutshell. So the final word is Mark's gospel on its own terms is not the founding charter of some new religion called Christianity that replaces Judaism or anything Jewish. That's just not the case. It's just not true. That's a category error by a mile, and you will be deceived if you believe that. I can promise you that. It is an urgent, apocalyptically charged proclamation made entirely within the categories of first century Jewish hope that Israel's God is going to act decisively and imminently through a spirit-empowered agent to bring completion and long-deferred promises of covenant renewal, restoration, the defeat of evil, and making all things right that have been wronged through our own devices through history. To flatten it into a story of an individual spiritual experience, like happens all the time in our Western kind of Christian church context, or to read it through the lens of later church doctrine, actually is really is to miss really what makes it so remarkable and so compelling, because it's a fierce rooted story and rooted in Israel's scriptures. It's political courage and it's unflinching and unyielding honesty about what fidelity to the God of Israel costs, and its unshakable conviction that the powers of this present evil age, all of the evil and injustice and all of the things that produce and inspire people to do evil, corrupt, wicked things, however dominant they appear, are living on borrowed time, and they know it. And so this is the messianic profile that we're going to get into, and I hope this is encouraging and stimulating, and I hope this has been a blessing for you guys, and I'm super excited to work through this in line by line fashion. So blessings. Looking forward to the next one.